Thanks so much for that generous introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. And thanks so much for having me here. And I just want to apologize. I won't be able to stay for the duration of the conference. I think the panel that preceded this one was great. I'm unfortunately working in the hospital this weekend, so I'm going to have to give this presentation and then drop. But I'm very excited to present about it, and I hope it will be of interest to you. It's about events from 2016, which may feel like the ancient past at this point. But of course, in Hinduism, what is happening now has happened before, and it will happen again. And by studying what happened before, we can better address what is happening now and have a better approach to the future. So I'm going to dive right in. And I'm going to just start by giving a brief overview of what this whole controversy was about 6 to 8 years ago, the California textbook controversy, why Hindu Americans cared so much about this topic. I'm going to show you how, when we tried to revise the curriculum, we were opposed by academics who, using very sophisticated language, were able to feed some pretty Hinduphobic tropes. I'm going to focus on the South Asia faculty group, which was sort of like the epicenter of this. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to show you how one of the most useful ways to understand academic Hinduphobia is as selection bias. And I'm just going to conclude with some thoughts on how to leverage this insight in the current environment. So why did we care about this topic? So this is just a page from a textbook that was in common use in 2016 from the Discovering Our Past series by Glenn Coe. This is the page, or one of the pages, about Islam. And so the pictures you will see are neutral to positive. You can see how big the Muslim world is as seen by the pilgrims at the Kaaba. You can see how a Muslim child is studying his or her religion. The text on the page compares Islam to Christianity and Judaism, which are religions familiar to most Americans, and the book emphasizes values, traditions, and humanity. It would instill pride in Muslims to read this kind of thing, and it might make it easier for American non-Muslims to relate to their Muslim classmates. In contrast, look at this entry on Hinduism from the same series. There is an extremely poor woman surrounded by trash. There's an old man, not child, in profile. The caption mentions untouchability and asks why the Aryans created the caste system. The text itself talks about the unfairness of the tradition. And the point, of course, is not going to be that caste should not be discussed. It's also not that we should not think about these things. But by dwelling on this in an introductory textbook, the same book is instilling shame in Hindus and actually making it harder for American non-Hindus to relate to their Hindu classmates. So what did we try to do about this? Well, Hindus had been trying to change these textbooks to help Americans understand Hinduism in a way that, among other things, they could better relate to it. In California, this involves a very, very long process, which I'm going to walk through in less than a minute. There are content standards, which are bullet points about a subject that get written. Each bullet point is then blown up into a paragraph or more of a frameworks document. And then each of these frameworks documents actually get blown up one by one into entire chapters and thousands of pages of textbooks. These textbooks get used in California, but obviously if you're creating books for such a large market, you might use it elsewhere in the US as well. So California and Texas and Florida are very, very important from this standpoint. And in 2014 to 2016, California was actually finalizing the frameworks. And so the history and social science frameworks are where a lot of Hindu activists focus their energy. These are basically, they're these 23 chapters about all aspects of India, Hinduism, etc. And they also, and they deal with obviously all of the religions. And they form the basis of the textbooks that are written. So it's a really good upstream place to have an impact. And so there's an instructional quality commission that sort of looks at edits that are proposed and then decides what to do. So Hindus had actually proposed a lot of edits, and Hindus had actually gotten a lot of those edits incorporated into these frameworks documents. And then the South Asia faculty group came in. And the South Asia faculty group was a very large number of academics who offered additional and very, very controversial edits. Now, we weren't using the term Hinduphobia widely back then, but the edits certainly felt antagonistic, destructive, or derogatory to many Hindus, so they met the textbook definition. But even though that bias was obvious to us, the SAFG used such academic language with such elegant citation that it was actually very difficult to effectively argue with them, except in very, very nitpicking sort of ways. And ultimately, the Instructional Quality Commission took them very seriously and accepted 80% of their edits without further discussion, at least at first. So I just want to give you an example of how this can feel, and I am sure this will be very familiar to any college students in this space. So this is one of the edits that the SAFG proposed. They said, we recommend deleting many important sages such as Valmiki and Vyasa were not Brahmins, since this information is incorrect, since both were Brahmins. So there was actually a group of scholars that were arguing against the edits of the SAFG. And they wrote this response, which was that further, in their letter of February 24th, the SAFG stated both were Brahmins, and you can see that the scholars walked through some of the reasons why the SAFG was incorrect in their assertion. And they give some citations and explanations. Now, the story, of course, does not stop there because the SAFG then counter-responded. I mean, remember, these people write for a living, and they're very, very good at finding citations and thinking through like how to support their arguments. And so they brought in these explanations about how they're always referred to as Brahmins. In this specific text, Vyasa's father is actually a Brahmin, even if his mother is a fisherwoman. Valmiki is a robber. That was later added. That wasn't actually part of the original Valmiki Ramayana. And the point is not that this has to be the last word. There are many counter arguments you could probably make. But imagine doing this for every single one of the edits that the SAFG proposed. So really, what I'm talking about right now is that we need a different strategy. So what could that strategy be? Here is where I want you all to start thinking about selection bias. So the way to do that is to say, okay, let's say that there are 10,000 facts about any religion that could be used to summarize it. And, the absolute numbers are not important here. Think about the overall theme. Now, if you are drafting a textbook, you're not going to cover 10,000 facts. You're going to sample, right? And so as any statistician will tell you, if you sample randomly, out of this, which is a very balanced treatment of Hinduism and Buddhism, 10,000 facts of which about 95% are positive and about 5% are negative, you'll end up with approximately 95 and 5. Now, it could be 94 and 6, it could be 93 and 7, but in any case, they'll be broadly similar across traditions. But suppose that a group like the SAFG comes along and they say that, you know what, this is not right. We actually recommend taking out 5 of these statements about Hinduism, and we'll actually add 5 more. And the ones that they choose are actually negative to add and positive to remove. Well, in that case, suddenly, Hinduism has 90 positive facts about it in the treatment and 10 negative facts. And this may not seem like much because the ratio of positives is still actually pretty similar. But when there's so few negative statements to begin with, a twice as much negative coverage of Hinduism as compared to Buddhism is actually going to be very, very noticeable. And that's exactly what happened. And so how do you look for something like this? So what we did, Suhag Shukla and I, is we actually took a hold of the frameworks documents. The entire 10th and 11th chapter is something like several hundred pages. It was 746 statements across those pages, 737 statements. And we took the 4 or 5 page SAFG edit and comprised it of its 86 individually suggested edits. And we said, we are going to look at each of these statements and we're going to grade them as, number one, are they about each of these 5 religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, or Sikhism? And the idea of these religions is that, number one, they're very natural to compare to one another. Why? Because they're covered together. And why are they covered together? Because their adherents interacted so much during the ancient and medieval history periods, which is what the 10th and 11th chapters cover. And we didn't talk about Christianity or Judaism because those are covered elsewhere. And also, this is American schooling. And so in general, Americans get a lot of information about Christianity and Judaism that's not just in textbooks, which might be very different from Hinduism, where that might be the only place they see it. So what is the tone of the coverage was the next question. So it covers the religion, but how does it speak about it? And so I go through this in more detail in the paper, but essentially there's 2 criteria by which you can grade a statement in this particular rubric as positive or negative or neutral. One is that it covers an American universal in a positive way. So anything that speaks about equality, liberty, mobility, expansion, things that Americans in general think of as good. that will be considered a positive about that tradition if the tradition is mentioned in like as being pro one of these. Then there's religion-specific identities. So Americans may not care about all of these, but they are an important part of the ethos of the religion. So for Hinduism, you could say, anytime I've ever heard any Hindu talk positively about Hinduism, they always mention how ancient the tradition is. They always mention it's a continuous tradition from ancient times. They recommend that it's very pluralistic, or they might say tolerant. That word has fallen out of favor, but that's something that is constantly mentioned. Jainism, it would be very hard to mention Jainism without mentioning the vegetarianism and the association with the Himsa. And so you can see that these are ways in which a religion is covered positively. A negative would be the opposite of this. So an opposite would be if goes against an American universal, right? So it's hierarchical, it's restrictive, it's inegalitarian. Those are the kinds of things that would make it negative. Or alternately, they basically call into question or cast doubt on some of the universals. So if you were talking about, for example, Jain kings who ate a lot of meat, that would be a negative. And neutral would be everything else. And I would say that the overall approach that we took was to consider most things neutral. It was a higher bar to prove that something was positive or negative. And one of the things we also wanted to assess was what was the net effect of the South Asia faculty group's edits on the history and social sciences framework. And for that, I need a little bit more explanation before I get to the heart of it. So before the SAFG edit, there was 4 possible configurations in the social sciences, the history and social sciences framework. So each note was either a positive statement, a neutral statement, or there was nothing there to begin with, or there was a negative statement. And after the SAFG edit, the same 4 things were possible. You could have a positive statement, a neutral statement, no statement at all, or a negative statement. So for example, if you go from a positive statement and you replace it with an equally positive statement or a positive statement in general, then that would be considered a neutral change. So a gray means neutral change. And I'm going to use this color convention throughout the talk. Gold means positive, red means negative, and black means nothing at all happened. And so a positive statement that stays positive is like a neutral change. But a positive statement that either becomes neutral or negative or is deleted entirely is a negative change. And then you can see how similar things would apply elsewhere, right? So like a neutral statement that becomes positive is a positive change. Neutral to neutral is neutral, etc. One slightly interesting thing that you might agree or disagree with, but deleting a neutral statement or adding a neutral statement are respectively negative or positive. And the rationale here is that all things equal, a neutral or positive statement about a tradition is still net new and good information to have. And so here are just some quick examples. So teachers should make clear to students that this caste system was a social and culture structure rather than a religious belief. This is what was originally in the frameworks after the edits that a lot of the Hindu groups, including the Hindu American Foundation, of which I'm a part, had been working on. After the edits that the SAFG suggested, teachers should make clear that this was a social and cultural as well as a religious belief. And so this is considered a negative change for, I think, reasons that hopefully are pretty obvious. Here's an opposite example from the SAFG. They suggested that this statement, after 1,000 Turks from Central Asia who were recent converts to Islam began to conquer states in northwestern India. This could be considered potentially negative, but I think it's neutral given that there's a lot of conquest in history books in general, and this is not necessarily framed in a universally negative way. But they changed it to after 1,000, they began to expand their territory. Now remember, in America, expanding your territory, manifest destiny, all the sorts of things that you all probably had taught to you in history class. This is relatively a positive change. And then finally, Buddhism waned in India in the late first millennium CE as the result of a resurgence of Hindu tradition. So this statement is slightly negative about Hinduism in the sense that it's implying that Hinduism waned. And it's slightly positive about Hinduism. It doesn't say that Hindus killed off the Buddhists, so that's still a positive. So it's a statement that is negative about Buddhism and positive about Hinduism. And after the edits, notice that now it says that Buddhism continued to be vibrant. Now, vibrant is a very positive word. It's still thriving. That's another positive word. And so that's a positive change for Buddhism. But it's actually a negative change because any mention about Hinduism gets deleted. And so I'm going to now go to my results where I talk about how, like, when you actually look at the numbers, what this all looks like. So just from the standpoint of raw numbers, I will also normalize to world and US proportion, or just actually in this case to world proportion, and the tone. What numbers of statements were positive, neutral, and negative? And then, so let's dive right in. So in the case of the frameworks, this is the frameworks that were really pretty extensive. You can see the number of words that were used. You can see the number of statements that were made about each tradition. You can see that Islam has the most absolute coverage. Makes sense. Islam has the most adherents. Hinduism was next up. Buddhism is like way, way less, which is interesting, something that we found. And you can actually see that as the number of your followers grows, your absolute coverage grows, but your proportional coverage does not grow by as much. So Islam is covered, approximately 147 words per percent of the world population that Islam represents in 2016. Hinduism is significantly more, but Jainism and Sikhism are more even than that, given that there's such a tiny number overall worldwide. And then when you look at the coverage, I think one big trend is obvious. So these are again the the HSSFW, the frameworks documents, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, and Sikhism. Number one, all of them are covered positively or neutrally most of the time. It is like a generally positive framing that happens. And as a religion has more followers, in general, the coverage becomes more neutral and slightly less positive. And so you can see that with Sikhism and Jainism, they're both more positive than neutral and no negative at all. Buddhism is more positive, some neutral, and like one negative statement. Hinduism is now significantly more neutral than it is positive, although there's a lot of positive as well, and there's some negative statements now as well. And Islam is, as you can see, there's several positive statements, there's a very, very large number of neutral statements, and then there are some negative statements. The trend towards less positive coverage was statistically significant. This is from Fisher's exact test for those who are curious, and I can sort of explain that in the QA if there's interest. From the standpoint of the South Asia faculty group, it's a really stark difference. Anyone notice all the red? So suddenly, half of the edits proposed by the SAFG are negative, or about 40% of them, I should say. And notice that their coverage of every other tradition is mostly positive. All of the edits they suggested about Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, and Sikhism were either positive or neutral, and very, very rarely did they even suggest any negative edits. And for Hinduism, you can see that the overwhelming number of their edits are negative. And then from the standpoint of how would this have impacted the frameworks if they were accepted wholesale? Now remember what I showed you earlier is that the SAFG, because they said, hey, we're the academics, look at how like objective our writing is, you should just accept our edits, and 80% of them were accepted before the Hindu community sort of mobilized and pushed back. And you can see that this would have led to essentially 13 fewer positive statements, 9 fewer neutral statements, and 6 additional negative statements in a relatively short frameworks document when you think about it altogether. And this is just in very stark contrast to the effect on every other tradition. In general, it added positive statements, or maybe at the expense of a neutral statement in a couple cases, and it removed negative statements. And again, this was highly statistically significant, p less than 0.001 by Fisher's exact test. So what does this all mean? I would say that if you are trying to approach academic Hinduphobia, this is actually a really effective way to show it, because it is just really, really common and pervasive, and it is actually really easy to do this with something like a middle school textbook because of the fact that it's intended for a very introductory audience where equitable coverage is like the common sense thing to do. And you might consider applying it to other spaces as well. You could say, hey, human rights websites, let's go look and see, like, are human rights atrocities documented against this tradition versus that tradition, against this group of adherents versus that group of adherents. It's pretty eye-opening. I haven't done this systematically, but I'm sure if you all go and type in Hindu to Human Rights Watch, for example, versus Muslim, you'll see some pretty stark differences. News sites is another place. And then, like, you might consider even applying this to like an Intro to Hinduism course. And I would just note that, again, with the keeping of, like, whatever has happened before is happening now and will happen again, this approach has been used before. So there is a very famous example from 1927 of this woman, this feminist scholar, Catherine Mayo, who wrote a report about India called Mother India. And it was so uniformly negative that Mahatma Gandhi, he referred to her as like a drain inspector. Like, if you go and you inspect a drain, what are you going to see? Dirt. And I think that, to my mind, still one of the best exposés of this kind of selection bias is Sankrant Sanu ji's work. He did a entry on our Encarta studies bias. This is back when Encarta encyclopedia was a thing, before Wikipedia, before the internet was like sort of widespread. And he showed that Wendy Doniger, she picked facts that made Hinduism look very, very bad, and it was very different from the way that both the Islamic point of view was respected and the way that the Christian point of view was explained. So I do want to say briefly, on the note of limitations, that there is a subjective component of the grading as I went about it. I tried to adhere to very transparent methodology, and I actually have here the QR link. It's also in the paper that accompanies this talk, where you can actually go look at this yourself, and you can see, like, if you agree or disagree with some of the ways in which we made these edits. But I think it would be fairly reproducible. And it does assume that religions deserve equal treatment. And I think that that is a fair assumption in the textbook space. I think that's a fair assumption in the way that we approach things in the news and the media. That may not be appropriate for all environments, certainly. But I did want to at least mention these as two potential limitations. So I will conclude by just noting that fair-mindedness is actually achievable. I was really pleasantly surprised when I did this analysis with Suhag that the round 2 frameworks documents, even though they were imperfect, they actually covered all of the South Asian religions in a fair way. But the SAFG documents were deeply biased and frankly Hinduphobic. They reduced the coverage of Hinduism in highly visible and very negative ways. And just to say, like, why should we care about a contested textbook process from 2016? It's 2022 now. And it's just because this is the way in which our community will continue to experience academic Hinduphobia. And so it will be very important for us to evaluate text or a body of work as a whole and how it compares to other text that's written in a similar way about other traditions, because that's where we can really show that something is rotten. So I will stop there and take any questions. Thank you all for your time.
For the latest on our YouTube channel, click subscribe and hit the bell icon for alerts on new content. Remember to like, comment, and share our videos. For more about HSC, you can visit the social media handles listed below.